The clink of fine china was all I heard as she set my food on a paper plate. My daughter-in-law's casual dismissal stung more than I expected. Still, I said nothing, my fingers tight around the flimsy edges. The smell of their rich meal, the soft gleam of their plates, only made the silence between us thicker. As I sat there, I realized this wasn't just about a meal. It was about who they thought I was. That's when I knew. I'd make sure they understood what it really meant to be overlooked. The will would be my final word. Before we begin, may I ask, where in this big, beautiful world are you listening from? It's always a quiet honor to know who's sharing this space. Drop it in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe. Helen stepped into the dining room, her eyes scanning the table. The polished mahogany gleamed under the soft candlelight, and the china was arranged meticulously, as always. The silver gleamed, the linen napkins folded in perfect symmetry. A Sunday dinner, the tradition of it, the ritual, was supposed to offer comfort, but tonight it felt hollow. Her paper plate felt too small in her hands. The edges crinkled ever so slightly as she took her seat at the far end of the table. The food on it was the same: roast chicken, mashed potatoes, green beans. But it was the vessel that mattered. "It's just easier, you don't mind, right?" Cassandra's voice cut through the air, a calm, practiced tone. Her eyes never wavered from her own plate, which was served on fine china, a sparkling contrast to Helen's flimsy plate. Helen swallowed, forcing a smile. Of course not, but inside, a sharp ache bloomed. It was the way Cassandra said it, as if it were nothing, no more significant than asking if Helen wanted more butter. The silence in the room stretched long as Todd barely glanced up from his food, his fork moving mechanically. He didn't make eye contact, not once, and Helen knew better than to expect him to. He avoided confrontation like the plague, and this wasn't just a dinner. It was something else entirely, a subtle yet sharp message of what she had become in their eyes. Across from her, Avery shifted uncomfortably, her gaze flicking between her parents and Helen. For a moment, their eyes met, and Helen saw the flicker of something in Avery's expression, an apology, perhaps, or confusion. Avery opened her mouth, then closed it again, as though the words caught somewhere in her chest. The silence thickened. Helen didn't need Avery to speak. She saw it in the way her granddaughter looked at her. She was caught between loyalty to her parents and the uncomfortable truth she couldn't voice. Helen wanted to reassure her, to say that it wasn't her fault. But the moment passed, and no words were spoken. The dinner moved on, the clink of silver on china louder than it should have been. Every bite they took, every delicate gesture, seemed to emphasize the distance between her and them. The laughter around the table, though not malicious, felt hollow. Helen's fork scraped her mashed potatoes, and it all felt so unnecessary. It wasn't the meal, it wasn't the food. It was the way everything around her had shifted, without ceremony, without care. After dinner, the cleanup was a blur. Cassandra's hands moved quickly, efficiently, as though they were in a hurry to put the evening behind them. Helen's plate, once full, was the first discarded into the trash. No thought, no recognition, just gone. She helped with the dishes, moving slowly, mechanically, as the weight of the evening settled around her. Her hands felt numb, the dish soap cold against her skin. But it wasn't the dishes that bothered her. It was the way the evening had unfolded, the subtle dismissal that had grown louder with each passing moment. Later that night, after the house had quieted, Helen sat alone in the living room. The stillness wrapped around her, heavier than usual. She pulled out her phone, her fingers slow as she found Maggie's name in her contacts. The phone rang once, then twice, before Maggie's voice came through. "You okay?" Helen leaned back in the chair, her eyes closing as the weight of the evening finally caught up with her. "I think I've been demoted to disposable." There was a long pause, but Maggie didn't need to say anything. She knew. "I'll be over tomorrow," Maggie said softly. Helen nodded, though Maggie couldn't see her. "Thanks." The line went quiet as Helen stared at the empty room. Tomorrow, she knew, would be different. This, whatever this was, would not go unchallenged. The evening after the dinner, Helen sat in the quiet of her home, the air thick with the weight of what had happened. The table, still set from earlier, now felt like a distant memory, a place she no longer belonged. She stared at the papers spread before her, her will, her estate plans, documents that had been signed years ago, before things had changed so drastically. Her eyes moved over the neat lines of text. Todd, Cassandra, Avery. Everything was left to them. The house, the savings, the heirlooms, all of it. Even the college fund for Avery, that small, hopeful gesture, felt more like an obligation than a legacy. Helen's fingers traced the lines of text. She had thought once that this would be her family's future, her contribution to their lives, her love, her sacrifices. But now, looking at these papers, she saw them for what they were: a convenient plan, a simple solution to her perceived usefulness. The money, the house, all of it tied up in people who had long stopped seeing her as family. The memory of past Christmases flickered through her mind: laughter, family, the glow of a decorated tree. But as the years had passed, Cassandra had slowly taken over the festivities. At first, it was small things: choosing the decorations, organizing the meals. Then, more deliberate acts. Helen had been pushed further and further from the center, until she was nothing more than an observer. The Christmases had become her absence, her role reduced to a background character in what was supposed to be her family's story. Helen leaned back in her chair, the bitterness rising in her chest. She closed her eyes, seeing once again Cassandra's casual dismissals, the subtle way she had distanced Helen from everything that once mattered. "It's just easier this way, you don't mind, right?" The words echoed in her mind. They always did, and they always would. The sound of her phone vibrating on the coffee table broke her reverie. She picked it up and saw Maggie's name flash across the screen. "You okay?" Maggie's voice was calm, but Helen could hear the concern beneath it. Helen didn't answer immediately, letting the silence settle between them. Maggie knew the answer. "I'm looking at my will," Helen said, her voice quieter than she intended. "Everything's left to Todd and Cassandra. Avery gets a college fund, and that's it." There was a pause, a breath from Maggie. "That doesn't sound right, Helen." "No," Helen whispered. "It doesn't." "I've been meaning to tell you," Maggie's voice softened. "It's always easier when they're done using you." Helen's chest tightened. The truth in Maggie's words stung more than she cared to admit. She had been used, hadn't she? Or worse, she had let herself be used. For appearances, for tradition, for whatever kept her from seeing the truth. "I need to make some changes," Helen finally said, her voice firmer than she expected. "I'll help." "No charge," Maggie replied quickly. "I'll set up a meeting with Jenna Palmer at Ruth and Blake Law." "We'll look over everything," Helen nodded, grateful, though she wasn't sure why. Maybe it was the promise of a new beginning, or maybe just the relief of not having to face this alone. She hung up the phone and sat in the silence, letting the weight of the moment settle. She had made a decision. Something needed to change. She wasn't going to let herself be dismissed. Not again. But before she could fully process it, another ping from her phone broke the stillness. It was a text from Cassandra. "Can you babysit next week? Bring your own lunch." Helen blinked at the words, feeling the heat rise in her chest. The message was so casual, so dismissive. It wasn't just the request. It was the way it was phrased. The underlying expectation that she would comply without question. No offer to include her in the family's meal. No acknowledgement of how things had shifted. Just, "Bring your own lunch." Her hand shook slightly as she typed her response. But then she stopped, her thumb hovering over the screen. Helen put the phone down. For the first time, she realized she didn't owe them an answer. She didn't have to keep playing the part they had scripted for her. She didn't have to keep pretending that she was fine with it. Tomorrow she would call Jenna. Tomorrow she would start over. Tomorrow the family would see that things had changed, that she had changed. But tonight, she was alone with her thoughts, her plans, and a single unshakable truth was settling in. It's time to reclaim what's mine. The law office smelled faintly of paper and polished wood, a place that felt both intimidating and sterile. Helen sat across from Jenna Palmer, who was leafing through the thick stack of papers in front of her. The room was quiet except for the soft rustling of the pages, the tapping of Jenna's pen against the desk as she reviewed Helen's will. The fluorescent lights above buzzed softly, almost drowned out by the heavy silence. Jenna paused, her fingers hovering over the document. Her eyes flicked to Helen, then back to the paper, then back to Helen again. They inherit everything, Jenna said, her voice flat. Did they write this for you? Helen exhaled slowly, a bitter taste rising in her mouth. I wrote it when I still thought they valued me, she replied. The words like shards of glass, sharp and cutting. Jenna didn't say anything at first. She simply nodded, processing. The way she looked at the papers, as though she could see the years of disillusionment, the years of quiet sacrifice, etched into the ink, made Helen feel like this moment had been a long time coming. But it still felt like an admission. She hadn't wanted to face it until now. I see, Jenna said, pushing the papers aside and folding her hands in front of her. Helen, you have options. We can revoke this entirely, start fresh. You can redistribute your estate, or even add conditions to the inheritance. Helen nodded slowly, each option lingering in the air like a decision she had been avoiding for years. She could still feel the weight of the paper plate from last night, the way Cassandra had dismissed her, the way Todd had stayed silent, the way they had taken so much for granted. What would you recommend? Helen asked, the words coming out softer than she intended. She wasn't sure if she was asking for guidance or just wanting confirmation that her feelings were justified. Jenna leaned back in her chair, tapping her pen on the desk. Well, a revocation would mean completely voiding the current will. You could then write a new one that reflects your wishes, not theirs. If you wanted to, you could distribute your estate among people who have been there for you, people who have shown up emotionally, not just financially. Helen's chest tightened as she considered it. Maggie, Avery, even her garden club members, who had quietly filled the space left by her family's absence. There were people who had cared, who had offered small gestures of kindness when no one else had. They were the ones who had seen her. I want to revoke everything, Helen said, her voice steady but firm. I want to start over, but I want a no contest clause included. I don't want them to challenge it. I want it to be clear that they aren't entitled to a thing. Jenna looked at her, an approving nod passing between them. Understood. We'll make sure that the new will reflects your intentions, with clear instructions. I'll include the no contest clause, so they can't do anything to reverse it. Helen paused, her fingers pressing against the edge of the table. The finality of it, the removal of Todd and Cassandra from her will, felt like the first breath of freedom she had taken in a long time. The weight of those years, of living in their shadows, of being erased from her own family's story, was suddenly lifting. Can I leave something to Avery? Helen asked, the thought forming slowly. Maybe a scholarship or something. A way to make sure she's never made to feel as disposable as I was. Jenna's eyes softened, her voice a little gentler. You can do whatever you like. A scholarship fund, a family archive, donations to your garden club, maybe even a memorial to your legacy. The possibilities are endless. Leave something that reflects your values, something that speaks to your story. Helen closed her eyes for a moment, imagining the possibilities. Avery could be part of something larger than just a passing family obligation. She deserved more than what Todd and Cassandra had set aside for her. The silence stretched as Helen thought, her heart beating faster as her plans began to take shape. This was the moment when she could truly reclaim what was hers. She wasn't just taking back her money or her house. She was taking back her place in the world, her dignity, her future. Make sure they know it's for them, Helen said softly, a weight lifting from her shoulders. They'll get nothing from me, not anymore. I want them to understand that they were never the ones who mattered. Jenna nodded again, her pen poised over the paper, ready to draft the changes that would rewrite everything. Helen stood and walked to the window, looking out at the street. Her mind raced with what was to come, how they would react, how they would fight back. But it didn't matter, not anymore. She was done waiting. She was done being erased. Tomorrow her family would learn the truth, that she was no longer the woman they thought they could control. The doorbell rang, pulling Helen from her thoughts. She stood straightening her cardigan and walked to the door. There, standing with a basket of warm bread and a container of soup, was Avery, looking both hesitant and hopeful. Her granddaughter smiled faintly. I thought you might like something real, Avery said, stepping inside when Helen opened the door. The quiet of the house wrapped around them, but it didn't feel as oppressive as it had before. Helen gave her a gentle hug, the kind they hadn't shared in years, but it felt natural. "Come on in," Helen said, moving aside. Avery set the food on the table, the smell of the homemade soup wafting through the air. There was a careful, deliberate nature to her actions, as if she were treating this visit like something sacred, something that hadn't been said in words but was understood. They sat down at the table. The silence was comfortable. The soup was warm, the bread freshly baked. It was simple, but it was real. "So," Avery began after a while, glancing at Helen, "I know I don't say this enough, but I'm sorry for how they treat you." Her voice was quiet, a little heavy with guilt. "I know it's not right." Helen's chest tightened, but she didn't flinch. She reached across the table and placed her hand on Avery's. "You didn't serve the plate," she said softly. Her words heavy with the truth they both knew, but hadn't said aloud before. Avery's eyes welled up. "I don't know how to fix it. It's like they don't see. I don't know what to do, Grandma." Helen smiled gently. "You're doing the right thing now, just by being here." They were silent for a moment, letting the weight of the conversation hang in the air. The quiet of the house, the soft clink of spoons against bowls, felt like a safe haven compared to the awkward, forced atmosphere she had just experienced with the rest of the family. Avery, at least, understood. At least she saw. After a while, Avery stood up, walking toward the back door to the garden. Helen followed, her heart lightening as she watched Avery touch the flowers gently, walking through the garden where she had once planted tulips as a child. It was a part of her past, a part of their bond, that hadn't been forgotten. "I remember planting tulips here," Avery said, her voice soft, filled with the nostalgia of childhood memories. "You told me they would always bloom, no matter what." Helen nodded. "They do, just like us sometimes. We bloom even when no one's watching." Avery stood still, looking at the rows of flowers. "I want to do something real, Grandma. Not like them. I don't want to be part of the things they expect." Helen's heart softened as she reached for Avery's hand. It was then that the thought hit her, clear as daylight. Avery was different. She hadn't taken anything for granted. She had a quiet strength about her. "I've decided," Helen said, the words feeling right, as though they'd always been there waiting to be said. "I'm going to put you in my will, Avery. Not because you're my granddaughter, but because you've shown me what it means to see someone. You understand." Avery's eyes widened in surprise. "Are you sure?" Helen nodded. "More than sure. You're the one who's always been there, who's always cared without wanting anything in return. You understand what it means to show up." She paused. Empathy over entitlement. Avery didn't know what to say, so she just squeezed Helen's hand, her emotions written clearly on her face. That night, Helen sat down at the kitchen table. She wrote down the incident from the dinner, every detail, every feeling that had been too much to ignore. She needed to document it, for herself, for Jenna. Maggie came by later that evening to read the notes. She skimmed the page, taking in each word. After a long silence, she looked up, her expression thoughtful. "It's polite, but it burns," Maggie said quietly, her voice tinged with a quiet understanding of the weight Helen carried. Helen nodded slowly. It was polite, it was formal, but it was also the truth, the kind of truth that couldn't be erased. Helen was scrolling through her phone when she saw it. The post. It popped up on her feed like a slap to the face. The kind of casual disregard that felt too deliberate to be accidental. There, in the middle of a family photo from the last gathering at her son's house, her arm was clearly visible. She was sitting at the edge of the table, holding a glass, her elbow bent awkwardly, as if she were trying to fit herself into a space where she didn't quite belong. But it wasn't the arm that caught her attention. It was the fact that her face had been cropped out, a perfect slice through the frame, cutting her entirely out of the family image. The picture had been altered, edited with cold precision. The betrayal felt physical, like a knife. Her thumb hovered over the screen for a moment before she dropped her phone onto the table. She didn't need to see more. A knock at the door broke her moment of stillness. Maggie walked in without waiting for an invitation, her eyes scanning the room before settling on Helen, who had already started to look for her phone again, her hands shaking slightly. "Did you see it?" Maggie asked, her voice low, almost knowing. Helen nodded, her gaze distant. "They erased me, like I never existed. Maggie walked over to her, looking down at the phone screen where the post still lingered, a digital ghost of Helen's presence. They erased you like a coffee ring on a tablecloth, Maggie said, her voice sharp with a mix of anger and sadness. Like you were a stain, something to scrub out and forget. Helen swallowed hard, the weight of Maggie's words sinking in. The image was just the latest in a long line of dismissals, but this one was personal. This one was meant to hurt. I can't let this go, Helen said, her voice catching as she gathered her thoughts. I can't just pretend it didn't happen. Maggie sighed and sat down beside her. No, you can't. But what are you going to do about it? Helen looked up at Maggie, a determination growing in her chest. I'm going to leave something behind, something they can't erase. Later that night, after Maggie had left, Helen sat at the kitchen table with a fresh cup of tea. She pulled the legal pad in front of her and started writing. The words flowed slowly at first, as if they were feeling their way through the darkness of everything she had kept inside. She needed to explain, to put down on paper exactly why she had made the decisions she had, why Todd and Cassandra were no longer part of her plans. Each letter was written with care, her thoughts and her history, her sacrifices, and her realizations spilling out in clear, deliberate strokes. She wrote for Avery, for the people who had truly shown up for her. She wanted them to understand why her legacy wasn't about money or possessions, but about presence, about the people who had seen her. I am not a photo to be cropped, not a piece of china to be tucked away on a shelf. When she finished the letters, Helen took a deep breath and set the pen down, a strange calm washing over her. The next morning, Avery came by, and Helen handed her a stack of old family photos, stacks of memories tucked away in boxes. Avery's eyes lit up as she looked through them. I thought we could digitize them, Avery said softly, uncropped, uncensored, just as they are. Helen smiled, a mixture of pride and sadness in her chest. I'd like that. We'll make sure they're remembered, even if they try to erase us. Later that afternoon, Helen received a text from Cassandra. She had expected it, the passively aggressive message, always designed to create a sense of distance without ever confronting the truth. I hope you didn't take the plate thing personally, Cassandra's message read. Helen stared at the screen, the words buzzing like a fly trapped in a jar. It was a hollow statement, meant to make her feel like she was the one at fault. She didn't reply right away. Instead, she set the phone down, and for the first time in what felt like forever, she didn't feel the need to respond. As she sat there, staring at the family photos Avery had brought over, Helen made a vow to herself. No more. No more letting them take the narrative. No more pretending everything was fine. She wasn't invisible anymore, and she wasn't going to let them erase her from anything else. The small, quiet room at Ruth and Blake Law smelled of leather and ink, a scent Helen had become accustomed to in recent weeks. The afternoon light filtered through the blinds, casting sharp shadows across the desk. Jenna Palmer sat behind it, her fingers moving swiftly over the keyboard, finalizing the details of Helen's new estate plan. Helen sat across from her, watching the process unfold. It wasn't about the money anymore. It was about control, about finally taking ownership of her story. Jenna paused for a moment, her gaze flicking up to meet Helen's. It's all set, Jenna said, tapping a few final keys before pulling the printed documents toward her. I've stored everything in 2 locations, locked and secured. It's as airtight as we can make it. Helen nodded, her hands steady but her mind whirling. This was it, the moment she had been working toward, the moment she could finally breathe again. The weight of years spent being overlooked, taken for granted, erased, it was lifting, piece by piece. Thank you, Helen murmured, her voice quiet but resolute. Jenna slid the papers across the table, but before Helen could reach for them, she hesitated. She looked down at the documents, her fingers tracing the edges of the folder as if she were holding something sacred, something that would outlast the superficial judgments of her family. There's one more thing, Helen said, her voice steady but carrying a sharp edge. I need to withdraw the backup key from Todd, quietly, firmly. Jenna looked up, reading the intent in Helen's eyes. Understood, she said softly. I'll take care of that for you. Helen's thoughts lingered on Todd. For years, he had held the key to her house, a symbol of trust that had long since been broken. Now, that key would be returned. And with it, her control. She wasn't handing anything over anymore. Later that evening, Helen sat at her kitchen table, the soft light of the lamp casting a halo around her as she pulled out a fresh sheet of paper. With a steady hand, she began to write a note, a letter meant to be read only upon her death. Her words flowed, each one deliberate, each one more powerful than the last. "Don't mistake politeness for permission," she wrote, underlining the sentence with a firm hand. She let the words sit there for a moment, the weight of them anchoring her in place. This was the final declaration, the quiet rebellion. She would no longer be silent. Her message would be clear to anyone who bothered to listen after she was gone. She signed the note with a flourish and folded it carefully, tucking it away in a drawer beside the final estate papers. That night, Avery came by to help her scan the old recipe cards, decades-old family recipes that Helen had preserved, each one etched in fading ink. They were more than just dishes. They were stories, memories, the tangible proof of a life that had been built with care. Avery moved around the kitchen with a quiet grace, setting up the scanner as Helen read through the recipes. "I thought we could donate these to the community cookbook," Avery said softly, her voice warm with the idea. "Maybe some of them could even find a place in that garden club charity event." Helen smiled, a little bittersweet. She watched as Avery carefully scanned each card, preserving the handwritten notes, the little smudges from years of use. These recipes were pieces of herself, a history that wouldn't be erased by anyone. "Made with real care," Helen said, as she read aloud one of the cards, her voice thick with emotion. "Served on porcelain." She paused, her gaze steady. "It's a reminder of who I was, not just what I had." Avery paused for a moment, looking up from the scanner. "It's beautiful," she said quietly. "It'll mean something to someone." The evening stretched on, a soft, quiet peace settling between them. After they'd finished scanning, they sat together at the table, sharing a quiet cup of tea. The next morning, a message from Cassandra flashed across Helen's phone. It was short, typical of her, a request veiled in politeness, tinged with passive aggression. "Just desserts this year. Can you bring pies?" Helen stared at the screen for a moment, the sting of the message sharper than she expected. A part of her wanted to respond, to push back, to finally confront the years of casual disregard. But something inside her held back. She didn't owe Cassandra an explanation, not anymore. Instead, she set the phone down without replying, the weight of the silence settling in the room around her. She had made her decisions, and she knew what she had to do. No more pretending, no more playing by their rules. Her story, her legacy, would not be shaped by their demands. It was time to move forward, and Helen was ready. Easter morning was soft and quiet. The sunlight filtered gently through the blinds, casting golden beams across Helen's kitchen table. The smell of freshly brewed coffee mingled with the faint scent of spring that drifted in from the garden. But there was no rush today, no clatter of dishes or demands to be met. No family gathering, no formal meal to prepare. Instead, Helen sat at the table alone, a quiet comfort settling over her. She had decided for once that she would not conform to the expectations of others. She would not join Todd and Cassandra's carefully staged Easter meal. With its porcelain settings and hollow conversation, she would not be an afterthought, not today. Instead, Helen spent the day with Maggie and the Oakwood Garden Club. The group had gathered in the community garden, each person working on their plot, talking about their latest blooms and the coming season. It was an unspoken tradition that had begun when she first joined, years ago, and it had become the place where she truly felt at peace, where she wasn't judged or overlooked. As Helen moved between the garden beds, her hands working with ease, she realized how much she had longed for this sense of belonging, of being surrounded by people who valued her not for her possessions, but for who she was. The morning passed in a quiet rhythm, the gentle chatter of the group mixing with the sound of birds in the trees. This was what Easter had always meant to her: growth, renewal, and connection. By late afternoon, the work in the garden had slowed, and the group gathered on the park benches to share lemonade and light conversation. Maggie sat beside Helen, glancing at her with a knowing smile. "How's the day been?" she asked, her tone warm but with an edge of curiosity. Helen leaned back against the bench, the day's satisfaction written across her face. "Better than I expected," she replied, feeling the truth of it in her bones. There was no longer any room for regret. Her decision was made, and it felt like the first deep breath she had taken in years. Just then, her phone buzzed in her pocket. She pulled it out, expecting it to be a message from Avery, but instead, it was Cassandra. "Hope everything is okay," the text read. Helen's eyes narrowed slightly. It was typical, an attempt to sound concerned while maintaining the distance that had become the norm. The polite veneer masking a deep well of disregard. Helen didn't respond immediately. Instead, she tucked the phone away, looking out at the garden once more. The softness of the flowers, the growth around her, everything felt right. Everything was finally where it should be. Later, as the garden club members began to disperse, Helen walked home slowly, her steps light but steady. It wasn't just the piece of the garden that lingered. It was the quiet rebellion of having chosen this life, this day, for herself. The table she had once been relegated to, at the mercy of others, had lost its center. And now it was her choice to walk away, to reclaim what was hers. When she returned home, she poured herself another cup of tea and sat down at the kitchen table. She had promised herself that she would start writing again. Write about the things that had been left unsaid. Write about her legacy, not for the family who had ignored her, but for Avery. She opened her journal, the pages crisp and inviting. As her pen touched the paper, the words began to flow. "I've spent my life serving a table that wasn't mine. And when I finally stopped serving, I was erased. But I've learned that the table was never where I belonged. I have chosen to build something for myself, something that no one can take from me. I leave this story for you, Avery, one of dignity, of strength, and of standing firm when the world tries to push you to the edges." Helen paused, her pen hovering over the page. The words were clear now. They had taken root in her heart and mind. And as she wrote, she felt something shift within her. She wasn't just writing a legacy, she was writing a reclamation. The doorbell rang, pulling her from her thoughts. It was Avery. She opened the door to see her granddaughter standing there, a look of quiet satisfaction on her face. "You missed Easter, didn't you?" Avery asked, her tone soft but filled with a mix of understanding and concern. Helen smiled, a warmth spreading through her chest. "Yes, I did," she said, stepping aside to let Avery in. "But I don't think I missed a thing." Avery paused in the doorway, her gaze softening. "It wasn't the same without you," she said quietly, her voice filled with a tenderness that made Helen's heart swell. Helen's smile deepened. For the first time in a long while, she didn't feel alone. "I know," she said softly. "It wasn't the same for me either, but it's different now. I'm different now." As they sat down at the table, Helen's phone buzzed again. Another text from Cassandra, but this time, Helen didn't look at it. She had everything she needed right here: Avery, the garden, her plans, and the quiet peace that came with knowing she was finally in control of her story. And that was more than enough. Helen sat at a corner table in the local coffee shop, the soft hum of conversation and clinking cups around her as she stared out the window. It was a quiet place, not too far from her home, and she'd chosen it deliberately, somewhere neutral, somewhere where Todd wouldn't be able to hide behind the distractions of their shared history or family expectations. She had agreed to meet him only because, for once, she wasn't going to shy away from the conversation that had been so long overdue. Her coffee, now cold, sat untouched in front of her as she waited. Her mind replayed the night of the paper plate over and over, the hollow sting of it still fresh in her chest. She had no illusions about what it meant. No matter how much she had done for him, for Cassandra, for the family, he had silently accepted the role of passive observer, as if nothing ever mattered beyond his own comfort. The door chimed as Todd entered, looking around awkwardly before his eyes settled on her. He smiled weakly, a smile that Helen could see was forced, a mask of politeness he wore because it was expected. He slid into the chair across from her, nodding at the coffee in front of him. "I was going to order something, but, well, here you are." Helen smiled back, but there was no warmth in it, no affection. just a recognition that this was it. The moment where things would either break or finally begin to mend. She wasn't sure which one she wanted. Todd cleared his throat, his fingers tapping nervously on the side of his cup. "How have you been, Mom?" His voice was careful, almost too careful, like he was testing the waters. "I've been well," Helen said, her voice steady, but there was a sharpness in her words that didn't go unnoticed. She leaned forward slightly, catching his eye. "I've been thinking about that dinner, about the paper plate." Todd stiffened, just for a moment, before he leaned back, his face a mask of discomfort. "You know, Mom, he started, but he faltered, his words getting caught in his throat. "No," Helen said, her voice firm, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. "I want to know why you didn't say anything, why you sat there in silence while I was put on display like that, why you let Cassandra dismiss me like that, like I was nothing." Todd shifted in his seat, his eyes flickering to the table, unable to meet her gaze. "It didn't seem worth making a scene," he said quietly, almost muttering the words. Helen's gaze hardened. "I was worth a scene." The words hung between them, heavy and final. Todd didn't say anything. Instead, he just stared at the table in front of him, his face flushed with guilt, with the weight of 1,000 unspoken truths. The silence stretched for longer than either of them liked. Finally, Helen broke the stillness. "I've changed my will," she said, her words measured, deliberate. She wanted him to understand the weight of this moment, not out of spite, Todd, but out of preservation. Todd blinked, his face pale. He opened his mouth as if to speak, then closed it again. The shock was written clearly across his face. "You're really doing this?" he asked, his voice trembling. Helen didn't flinch. She didn't hesitate. "I already did." The words hung between them like a declaration of independence. It was a finality in Helen's voice, one that Todd hadn't heard before. He stared at her, unable to grasp what was happening. For a moment, he looked as though he might say something, plead with her, perhaps, to reconsider. But the words never came. Instead, he just sat there, his hands still nervously fidgeting with the edge of his coffee cup. Helen knew what this was. He was shocked because, for the first time, she had made a decision for herself, without his approval, without the shadow of their past decisions hanging over her. For the first time, she had put herself first, and Todd wasn't sure how to deal with it. Her gaze softened, but only slightly. "I've done this for myself, Todd. You didn't want to be a part of my life when it mattered, and I can't keep pretending that you did." Todd swallowed hard, his expression pained. He opened his mouth again, but his words didn't come. He was paralyzed by the truth that had been slowly unraveling for years and had finally come to a head. "I didn't want this to be how it ended," he said finally, his voice low, full of regret. "I never wanted you to feel like this." Helen studied him for a moment, weighing his words. The guilt in his eyes was palpable, but it wasn't enough anymore. It wasn't enough to undo the years of silence, the years of avoidance. She had waited long enough for him to act, to speak up. She wasn't waiting anymore. "I'm not angry," she said, her voice softer now but still resolute. "I'm just done waiting for you to see me." Todd looked up at her, his eyes wide, but no words came. Helen knew there was nothing left to say. It wasn't anger that had driven her to this point. It was acceptance. Acceptance that she would no longer be the one to make excuses, to smooth things over. She had given enough of herself away. Now she was taking it back. "I'll send you the final copy of the will," Helen said as she stood to leave. "Make sure you understand it." She turned to walk away, leaving Todd in the chair, his hands still trembling, his face etched with the realization that he had been too late. Avery walked into the living room, phone in hand, her face a mixture of frustration and resolve. She handed Helen the phone without a word, her thumb still hovering over the screen. "It's from Cassandra," Avery said, her voice a touch tight. "I didn't respond. Should I?" Helen looked at the message, a faint sense of recognition stirring deep in her chest. The words on the screen were passive, designed to deflect any real accountability. "I hope everything is okay. You didn't take it personally, did you?" Helen's lips thinned as she read, her eyes narrowing slightly. She wasn't surprised. It was just another attempt to shift the blame, to make her seem unreasonable. Cassandra had always been good at that, making everything about her, even the things she had no hand in. No, Helen said, her voice steady and calm. The silence says more. Avery stared at the phone for a beat longer, as though waiting for the message to somehow change, to reveal some hidden apology that wasn't there. But there was nothing. Just words that meant nothing. Words that erased. Helen put the phone down, feeling the weight of that message sink into her chest like a stone. There was nothing to say to it. She had moved past this point. She was done fighting for acknowledgement that would never come. Just then, the phone buzzed again. But this time, it wasn't from Cassandra. It was a group text from the Oakwood Garden Club. We've chosen Helen as the honorary chair for the upcoming spring event. Looking forward to hearing your speech. A small thrill ran through Helen at the message. She hadn't been expecting this. Her heart skipped as the weight of it settled in. This was real. She was being recognized, not by her family, but by the people who had shown up for her, people who saw her for who she was, not what she could give. Later that week, Helen stood at the podium at the Garden Club's spring event, the soft hum of conversation around her. Her hands were steady as she adjusted the microphone, feeling the eyes of the room on her. She could see Avery sitting at the front, her expression proud, supportive. The members of the Garden Club, the ones who had been with her through the years, were gathered around, eager to hear what she had to say. I wasn't sure I was going to speak today, Helen began, her voice clear, strong. I've spent so much of my life silenced, waiting for someone to tell me it was my turn. But this place, this club, you all showed me something I never expected. I was already part of something. I've already been seen. Helen paused, her eyes scanning the room. She could feel the room shift, the energy in the air changing as people leaned in. She wasn't asking for approval, but it was there anyway, quiet, sure. She took a breath and began to read from her legacy letter, the personal essay she had written for Avery, a message for when she was gone. It wasn't just about the house or the money, it was about the truth, about the way Helen had lived, the way she had fought for recognition. This is what I leave behind. Not possessions, not material things, but the understanding that we deserve to be seen, to be valued. I spent too much of my life waiting for someone else to tell me I was worth it. But now I know, and I leave this for you. Avery, always choose yourself. Always choose the people who see you, who honor you for who you are, not for what they need from you. As she spoke, the room fell silent. Half the room, she noticed, had tears in their eyes. It wasn't the content of the words alone, but the truth and weight behind them. They understood. They had been part of it, part of the journey that had brought her to this place. When she finished, the applause was slow at first, then grew, building until it felt like the air itself was vibrating with energy. Helen held her hands up in a quiet gesture of thanks, but inside, something was shifting. She was no longer just the woman who had been overlooked or erased. She was the woman they were now listening to. She was the woman who had stood up. Later that evening, after the event had wound down and the club members had gone home, Helen sat with Avery in the kitchen, sorting through old family stories. Avery had brought, over a stack of journals, handwritten notes, and photographs, stories of Helen's past, her mother's recipes, their family traditions. I thought we could start archiving these, Avery said, her eyes scanning the handwritten pages, her fingers tracing the edges of a faded recipe card. Maybe turn it into a memoir. Just something for us, for you. Helen smiled softly, taking a deep breath. I think it's time. Time for the world to hear it. As they worked, Helen felt something she hadn't in years, a sense of purpose, the stories, the recipes, the memories. All of them were hers. Not for Todd, not for Cassandra, not for anyone who had ever overlooked her. These were pieces of her, of who she had been and who she had become. Avery paused for a moment, looking up from the papers. Grandma, you're giving all this away. The china, the memories. Why? Helen leaned back, her gaze steady. Because it was never about the china. It was about what's real, what stays. And I want to make sure the things that mattered most go to the right places. She had already begun to donate china sets to local girls' homes and women's shelters. A quiet act of generosity that wasn't about legacy, but about giving what she had to those who would appreciate it, those who needed it. It wasn't the legacy others had expected her to leave behind, but it was hers. Avery nodded, her eyes glistening. I get it, Grandma, I really do. Helen smiled, a final sense of peace settling over her. She wasn't just leaving behind dishes and furniture. She was leaving behind the truth of who she was, and no one, not even Cassandra, could ever erase that. The room was quiet, save for the soft scratching of the pen as Helen signed the final documents. The thick stack of papers lay before her will, her trust, her legacy. She had read each clause, each word, more times than she could count. But now it was done. It had to be. Jenna Palmer sat across from her calm presence a steady anchor as Helen signed the final directive. The ink was still fresh on the page as Helen laid the pen down, her fingers lingering on the documents for a moment longer than necessary. Everything is as you've instructed, Jenna said, her voice low and professional. It's all locked away, secured in the vaults. It's done. Helen nodded, her mind already moving ahead to what came next. She had made her peace. This was more than just a legal formality. It was the last step in claiming her life back, the final act of taking control. She sat back, the weight of the decision settling in. Todd and Cassandra had been officially disinherited. The house, the savings, the heirlooms, all of it was gone from their grasp, just as they had gone from hers. The silence between them would speak louder than any words ever could. Avery's portion wasn't tied to an inheritance of wealth or material things. It was tied to something far more important. A scholarship fund in her name, the continuation of the family archive stewardship. Avery would take the lessons of her ancestors, the stories and memories that Helen had preserved for so long, and carry them forward. This wasn't just about the past. It was about ensuring the future. And Helen hadn't forgotten where she came from either. A portion of her estate was to be donated to Oakwood Garden Club, where she had spent so many years cultivating not just flowers, but friendships, and a local nonprofit, a domestic dignity charity that focused on empowering women and providing them with the resources to stand tall, as Helen had done. She could already hear the voices in her head, Cassandra's, Todd's, even Maggie's, wondering why she had chosen to do things this way. Why not leave it all to Avery and call it a day? But it wasn't about that. It was about ensuring the right people had what they needed, not the ones who had neglected her. Helen stood, and Jenna gave her a quiet nod of approval. It was official now. No more whispers. No more wondering if she was making the right choice. This was it. That evening, Maggie came over, as promised. The day had felt long and full. But Maggie's presence always had a way of making everything feel lighter. She was holding 2 glasses of sparkling cider, one for herself, one for Helen. They sat down at the kitchen table, the same one where Helen had spent so many years cooking meals for others, giving parts of herself away. Maggie raised her glass. "To the finest damn paper plate I've ever seen thrown back," she said, a grin tugging at the corners of her mouth. Helen laughed, the sound filling the room in a way she hadn't heard in years. It was a laugh born from relief, from joy, from freedom. "I never thought I'd hear you say that," she replied, shaking her head in mock disbelief. But it was true. The paper plate had come to represent so much more than a simple meal. It had become a symbol of everything she had endured, everything she had survived. "To the paper plate," Helen said, lifting her glass, "and to everything it stood for, and to everything it no longer does." They clinked their glasses, the sound a soft chime of finality, and Helen drank deeply. The cider was crisp and refreshing, and for the first time in a long while, Helen allowed herself to simply be present. She wasn't looking over her shoulder anymore. She wasn't waiting for validation or permission. She was free. Maggie looked at her with a soft smile, a warmth in her eyes. "You did it, you know." Helen paused, her fingers tracing the edge of the glass. "I didn't just do it for me, Maggie," she said, her voice quiet but steady. "I did it for Avery, for the women who came before me, for the ones who will come after." The room fell silent for a moment, and in that stillness, Helen felt something she had never felt before: peace. There were no more questions, no more wondering if she had done the right thing. She had claimed her legacy, not just for herself, but for everyone who had helped her see who she really was. The doorbell rang, pulling them from the moment. Avery had returned, her face glowing with something between anticipation and pride. "Grandma, are you—" Avery's words faltered as she stepped into the kitchen. Seeing the two women sitting at the table, the cider glasses raised, the sense of calm in the air, Helen smiled up at her, her eyes bright. "Come sit with us," she said, motioning to the chair beside her. "We're celebrating." Avery sat down, her eyes searching Helen's face. "Celebrating what?" she asked. Helen's smile deepened. "We're celebrating the future and the strength to leave the past behind." Avery's gaze softened, and she reached over, taking Helen's hand in hers. "I think I understand now," she said, her voice a quiet affirmation of everything they had built together. For the first time, Helen felt that she wasn't just leaving behind memories or belongings. She was leaving behind a legacy of strength and survival, one that would carry forward in Avery, in the scholarship fund, in the stories shared, and in the lives touched by the kindness she had chosen to pass on. There was nothing more to do, nothing more to say. She had taken the final step, and in that moment, Helen knew that no one could ever rewrite her story. Helen sat at the kitchen table, her fingers lightly tracing the edge of the empty coffee cup, a quiet peace enveloping her. She wasn't looking for anything to disturb it, not today. But then the phone buzzed, breaking the silence. A message. From Cassandra. Helen hesitated before picking it up. She had already moved past the need for validation from her son or his wife, but the pull of curiosity was always there, lingering. She unlocked the screen, her gaze drawn to the familiar name. The message wasn't unexpected. She had been waiting for this, in some way. The post, the aftermath of her final decision. The message was passive, attempting to control the narrative in the only way Cassandra knew how. The words were cold. "I hope everything is okay. You didn't take it personally, did you?" Helen read it slowly, her eyes narrowing. The weight of the words settled in, empty, casual, as if nothing had ever truly mattered. The arrogance of it stung, but she didn't flinch. The silence around her grew louder with each passing second. "Should we respond?" Avery asked from across the room, her voice soft but firm. She had seen Helen's reaction, the quick glance down at the phone, the way the lines around her mouth tightened. Helen put the phone down without saying a word, the weight of her response already felt in the stillness of the room. The silence said more than words ever could. "No," she replied finally, her voice quiet but resolute. "The silence says more." Avery nodded, understanding. She had seen enough of this game to know it was over. There was no point in responding, no point in explaining, in trying to force Cassandra to see what she had been blind to all these years. Sometimes silence was the only answer left. The rest of the afternoon passed quietly. The estate documents had been finalized and signed, the legacy established. Avery had already begun sorting through the family archives, making sure that what Helen had left behind would be honored. As the evening settled in, Helen received an email from Jenna Palmer. She opened it with a quiet sense of finality. Another step in the process. "Dear Helen, I'm sending you a certified copy of your final estate plan for your records. Everything has been filed and locked. Your legacy is secure." Helen sat still for a moment, her fingers resting on the edge of the paper. She felt the weight of it. This was it. The plan was set. There would be no going back, no more second-guessing. She wasn't leaving behind something small or easy to dismiss. She was leaving behind proof that she had existed as more than their convenience. Helen carefully filed the email and the estate plan in the drawer of the kitchen cabinet. She had already written it on the folder's label, proof I existed as more than their convenience. It was the final declaration. There would be no confusion, no more erasure. The quiet hum of the evening continued as Helen finished her tea. But just as the night settled in, her phone rang. Cassandra's name flashed across the screen. Her stomach tightened, but she answered. "Mom, I'm so sorry, Cassandra's voice was full of emotion, her words faltering, thick with false regret. Helen listened for only a few seconds, but it was enough. Enough to hear the same hollow apology she had heard before. The tears in Cassandra's voice felt like a tactic, manipulation disguised as vulnerability. But it didn't reach Helen anymore. Without a word, Helen ended the call, her thumb hovering over the screen. There was nothing left to say. The apology came too late, and the sincerity was nowhere to be found. Avery walked into the room, pausing when she saw Helen's face. "Everything okay?" she asked, her voice quiet but concerned. Helen nodded, setting the phone down. "She's sorry, or thinks she is." Avery sat beside her, her voice steady. "You don't owe her anything." "No," Helen replied, her tone firm but soft. "I don't." That night, as the moon rose high and the house grew quiet, Maggie arrived. Helen found her sitting on the porch, as she often did. The evening air was cool, the soft chirping of crickets filling the space between them. Maggie was waiting for her without words, as if understanding that the silence had already spoken for them both. They sat together, two women bound by years of shared history and understanding. No more words were needed. The world had tried to erase them, but here they were, still standing. Helen didn't need Cassandra's apology. She didn't need Todd's approval. She had lived through their neglect, their dismissal, and now she had created a space where she would never be erased again. No one could rewrite her story. And as she sat beside Maggie, watching the stars shimmer in the night sky, Helen felt a quiet strength within her, a strength that could never be taken away. Helen sat in the quiet of her living room, the soft glow of the table lamp casting long shadows over the papers in front of her. Avery had just handed her the printed version of the essay, the paper plate and the china cabinet, her own words now inked on paper, ready for the world to see. It felt surreal, but it also felt like something Helen had been working toward for years. She took a deep breath, her eyes scanning the words, the raw truths she had once kept hidden. Now they were on display, her story laid bare for anyone willing to listen. She wasn't just telling her story anymore, she was sharing it with the world. "I think it's perfect," Avery said, her voice quiet but filled with pride as she stood beside Helen. "The magazine's going to print it next month, and they're already talking about featuring it in the local paper." Helen nodded, her heart swelling with a quiet sense of achievement. "It feels real now," she murmured, running her fingers over the paper's edge. A few days later, the magazine hit shelves, and Helen's essay made its debut. It wasn't just the local publication, it spread like wildfire. The story was shared, quoted, and printed in neighboring town newsletters. Everywhere she turned, someone was talking about the woman who had been erased and how she'd finally reclaimed her place. The recognition was bittersweet. It was what she had always wanted but could never get from her own family. The world was finally listening to her, but Cassandra and Todd, they didn't even know what they'd lost. That evening, the Oakwood Garden Club president called, her voice full of emotion. "Helen, we just wanted to thank you personally. Your story is inspiring. You've touched so many hearts. Yours will be the keynote at our annual fundraiser this year." Helen smiled, but it wasn't just because she was being acknowledged. It was because for the first time, the quiet strength she had held inside for so long had found its place. She wasn't invisible anymore. A few days later, Jenna Palmer stopped by with a packet in hand. "Helen," she said, her voice full of warmth, "I've drafted a press release about your legacy gift to the Oakwood Garden Club and the Domestic Dignity nonprofit. It'll be sent to the media in the coming days. I also want to confirm that all the final estate documents have been processed." Helen took the press release, a small but significant part of the larger shift she had undergone. It wasn't just the money or the property, it was the impact. It was about making sure her story, her generosity, and her values endured. That evening, Avery returned, holding a large framed version of the essay. She placed it carefully on the table, a proud smile on her face. "I thought you might like to hang it," she said softly. Helen took the frame in her hands, her heart swelling with pride as she gazed at her words. It wasn't just a piece of paper anymore. It was a declaration, a reminder, a legacy. "You're right," Helen said, her voice thick with emotion. "I am proud of this." Later, the two women stood in the living room, the framed essay now hanging on the wall. For the first time in years, the room felt like it was hers, not just a space she had inhabited, but a place where her truth lived. Avery stood beside her, looking up at the framed essay. "Grandma, you did it," she said quietly, her voice full of respect and understanding. Helen smiled, her gaze shifting to the wall where the story now lived. "We did it," she corrected gently. "Together." The evening passed in silence, save for the occasional rustle of papers and the quiet comfort of shared understanding. Helen had found her place, not just in the world, but in her own home, in her own legacy. No one would erase her now. Helen stood in her front yard, the morning sun casting long shadows over the garden she had cultivated for so many years. The soil, rich and soft beneath her hands, felt like an old friend. Today the yard wasn't just a space for flowers, it was a place of transformation. Today she was planting something that would outlive her, something that would bloom long after she was gone. Avery was beside her, her hands gloved and steady, as she placed the daffodils and tulips in neat rows. The bright yellow of the daffodils and the soft pink and purple of the tulips stood out against the rich green of the grass, a hopeful contrast to the quiet of the morning. "This place," Helen said softly, her voice almost a whisper, "used to feel like a place I didn't belong, like I was just taking up space." Avery looked over at her, pausing for a moment. "You don't feel that way anymore, do you?" Helen shook her head. "No, I don't. Not here." She glanced over at the Oakwood Living Legacy Project sign at the edge of the yard, a small marker that had been placed when she donated part of her garden to the project, a community space where new generations could come and plant, tend, and grow. It wasn't just about the flowers, it was about the permanence of it, her legacy, living on in something tangible, something that would keep growing, even when she was gone. By mid-afternoon, the plants were in place. Avery stepped back, wiping the sweat from her brow, surveying their work. The rows of flowers were neat and colorful, bright against the green backdrop of the yard. Helen stood next to her, proud and still, as if she could almost feel the future blooming beneath her fingertips. "There," Helen said with satisfaction, stepping back and surveying the flowers. "This is where it begins, the flowers I chose for my goodbye." A few days later, the community finished installing a bench at the edge of the garden, facing the newly planted bed of daffodils and tulips. The inscription on the plaque was simple, yet it carried the weight of everything Helen had fought for, everything she had endured. For those who chose dignity over display. Helen sat on that bench every morning, her coffee cup in hand, watching the flowers sway in the early morning breeze. It was her ritual now, this quiet moment of peace before the rest of the world woke up, before the noise and the chaos of life settled in. Sometimes Maggie joined her, their conversation a soft murmur that blended with the chirping of birds. Other times it was just Helen, alone with her thoughts and the flowers. It was a place of comfort, a place where she could feel at peace with everything she had done, with everything she had built. There was no pretense here, no family to demand anything from her. It was her space, one she had made, one she had claimed for herself. One morning, as Helen sat on the bench, sipping her coffee, she saw a car slowly drive by. It was Cassandra's car, its sleek silver frame gliding down the street without hesitation. Helen watched as it passed, her gaze steady, her hands steady around the cup. Cassandra slowed, just for a moment, as if she might stop, as if she might somehow acknowledge the space that had been created in her absence. But she didn't. The car continued down the street, disappearing around the corner. Helen didn't wave. She didn't move at all. She just sat there, her eyes fixed on the road, the quiet of the morning filling the space where words once were. Cassandra had chosen to leave, and Helen had chosen to stay. But the difference now was that Helen had a place that mattered, a place where she was seen. The next day, as the sun rose higher in the sky, Helen was back at the bench again, the morning still and quiet around her. The daffodils were starting to bloom, their bright yellow faces turning toward the sun. The tulips would follow soon, their delicate petals opening like a promise. She had chosen this, chosen to leave behind something that would live on without her. It was no longer about the china, the plates, or the family. It was about growth. It was about life that didn't depend on anyone else's approval. And as the morning sun warmed the garden, Helen knew that no one, not even Cassandra, could take this from her. She had made something lasting, something that would keep growing, even when everything else faded away. Helen passed quietly in her sleep, a peaceful end to a life that had been too often marked by struggle, The house was still and quiet in the early morning light, the faintest warmth from the rising sun spilling through the windows. In her final moments, Helen had left behind not just the memories of a lifetime, but a legacy that would carry on, one that would be felt in the hearts of those who truly knew her. A few days after Helen's passing, Jenna Palmer arrived at the house. In her hands were 5 sealed letters, each one marked with a name. She set them down on the kitchen table, the place where Helen had always sat, a place that now felt emptier than ever. These letters were Helen's final messages to those who had been a part of her life, for better or worse. Jenna opened the first letter, Todd's. She read it slowly, her eyes scanning the few short lines. You chose comfort over courage. It was cold and direct, but it was true. Todd had always played it safe, never confronting the discomfort of standing up for what was right. He had chosen the path of least resistance, even if it meant letting his mother disappear into the background. The letter was a final acknowledgement of that choice, a reminder that while Helen had given him everything, he had never truly fought for her. Next was Cassandra's letter. Jenna opened it with a sigh, already knowing what to expect. It was one sentence, just as Helen had predicted. Next time, use a real plate. The words stung with their indifference, a perfect echo of Cassandra's inability to truly see her mother-in-law for who she was. The dismissiveness, the casual cruelty, it had defined their relationship. But now, Cassandra's words had no power. They were just empty, hollow phrases, and Helen was gone. The letter, much like Cassandra's treatment of Helen, was a final insult, offered without a second thought. Jenna placed Cassandra's letter aside and turned to the third, Avery's. She hesitated for a moment, knowing that this one would be different. It was long, filled with the kind of truth that Helen had always hoped to pass on. Avery's letter spoke of the lessons she had learned from her grandmother, the quiet strength Helen had always carried with her, even when it seemed no one noticed. Avery spoke of love, pride, and the legacy that Helen had built, not in material things, but in the lessons passed down. The final words made Jenna's heart ache with their beauty. I will carry you with me, Grandma. Your strength, your stories, your heart. I will make sure the world knows the woman you were, not just the one they erased. The letter was everything Helen had wanted. Avery understood. She would carry the truth forward. Finally, Jenna turned to Maggie's letter. It was short but full of quiet gratitude, a love letter to their friendship. Maggie had seen Helen for who she truly was, beyond the plate, beyond the china, beyond the expectations others had placed on her. Maggie's letter ended simply, "Thank you for reminding me I mattered." In those few words, Maggie had captured the essence of their relationship. Helen had always made others feel seen, made them feel like they mattered, even when no one else did. The letters lay there in front of Jenna, each one a testament to the woman Helen had been, the woman she had become, and the legacy she left behind. Jenna took a deep breath, her fingers brushing the edges of the paper. She had always admired Helen for her quiet strength, for her ability to withstand so much without ever asking for recognition. Now, as she read these letters, Jenna saw the full picture, the woman who had been erased by some, but whose legacy would never be forgotten. Later that afternoon, the nonprofit where Helen had donated so much of her estate held a small tribute in her honor. The room was filled with people who had been touched by her story, her strength, and her generosity. The topic of China came up briefly, as it always did, but it was quickly dismissed. No one had time for those material things anymore. What mattered was the legacy Helen had built with her actions, her strength, and her kindness. As the tribute ended and the last guest began to leave, Jenna stepped outside, the weight of the letters heavy in her hands. She looked out at the horizon, the sun setting slowly, and knew deep down that Helen's story would live on. No one could erase it now. Avery stood at the head of the room, her hands steady as she scanned the list of recipients for the scholarships, the garden funding, and the legacy dinners. She had taken on the responsibility of overseeing the estate's legacy. But it was more than just paperwork. It was a commitment to ensure that Helen's values lived on long after she was gone. This wasn't about guilt or obligation. It was about gratitude. The estate, funded by Helen's final decisions, had already begun making a difference in ways that couldn't be measured by money alone. Scholarships were given to deserving young people who would carry forward Helen's legacy of resilience. Gardens were being cultivated in communities that needed them, spaces that would grow long after the last seed was planted. Reading rooms were being established in local libraries, quiet spaces for reflection and learning. Helen had always believed in the power of quiet change, the kind that didn't need to shout or be seen to make an impact. Now it was unfolding before Avery's eyes, just as her grandmother had intended. A letter arrived a few days after Helen's passing, addressed to Todd and Cassandra. It was formal, polite, but there was no mistaking the finality in the words. The letter outlined the details of the will, and with it, a stark statement. No inheritance, no loopholes, no appeal. Avery read it once, then again, the words sinking in. It wasn't a decision made out of malice, but out of self-preservation. Helen had given them everything she could. Years of care, of service, of love, and they had taken it all for granted. Now there would be no more empty promises or passive dismissal. She folded the letter and set it aside, her heart heavy but resolute. This was the final act of courage, of standing up for herself when no one else had. That evening, Avery sat in the quiet of her grandmother's house, the room now just a shell of what it had once been, empty, but not without meaning. She reached into a drawer and pulled out the paper plate, the one Helen had saved that night, the night it all changed, the plate that had come to symbolize everything Helen had endured, everything that had led to this moment. With great care, Avery framed the plate. It wasn't about the plate itself. It was about what it stood for. It stood for strength, for resistance, for a woman who had never been truly seen, but who had fought anyway. It wasn't a dinner plate. It was a symbol of how far she had come, of what she had survived. The plate now sat beside the china cabinet in the Oakwood Center, a quiet tribute to the woman who had refused to be erased. A plaque rested beneath it, etched in gold letters. Respect is not inherited. It's served. Avery stood back, taking in the framed plate, the plaque, and the quiet power it held. Her grandmother's legacy wasn't in the things she had given to her family. It was in the quiet defiance she had lived by, in the dignity she had carried, in the lessons she had passed down. It wasn't just the flowers, or the scholarships, or the donations. It was everything that had made Helen who she was. Avery ran her fingers over the plaque, the weight of it settling in her chest. She would carry this legacy forward, not just in the things she managed, but in the way she lived her life, in the way she treated others. She would honor her grandmother's story by making sure it wasn't forgotten, by making sure she, too, would never be erased. As she stood there, a final thought flickered through her mind, a thought that echoed with a quiet strength. They put my food on a paper plate while they ate off china. Said, "It's just easier this way, you don't mind, right?" So I made everything harder for them, starting with the will. Avery smiled softly to herself. Helen had always been a woman who did things her own way, and now her legacy would live on, untouched by those who had tried to diminish it. Helen had made everything harder for them, but she had also made it easier for Avery to see the truth.